box. You have to like.
Well, I think that's like usually the issue, but like this one is like really well made.
Okay.
Like folds up the right way. I mean, I'm surprised it doesn't even have like a remote that just deploys.
Someone's seen your project.
Huh?
Someone's seen your project.
Raspberry Pi self-deploying tree. All right, let's see where we left off here. I know we were doing ROT13 conversion stuff.
Yeah. Rotate the chain.
Where's my phone?
Yeah.
Oh, and if I remember correctly, we were doing our fourth version of this where we were trying to do the math with the things, and we had a weird result. Probably we did the math a little wrong. But this one's probably the cleanest version of ROT13. Have a string that has all the letters of the alphabet and return the position of the character that you're looking for plus 13 mod 26. That way it wraps around onto the alphabet. All right, so this was ROT13 Caesar cipher thingamajiggy. All right, so what we did is we put in a letter here or something. I think we were doing only capital letters, and I think right now it's actually incorrect, but because of our math. But if we switch this to we'll just go to our third version here, ROT13.3. So I put in a Y becomes a L. All right. So that does the conversion. So now I want to add a button to convert it back. Okay, so kind of what we're learning here is how do we have buttons do things? How do we read in from edit boxes? All right, so now I want to add another button. So right now I have a button that takes from this guy and converts it into its ROT13. So now I want one that will undo that. Okay, so we'll go into our interface. We're going to build, put another button in there. All right, so remember interface is this big vertical linear layout thing. I'll throw another button down here. We'll change the text on this guy to just say decode. Yeah, so really this guy should be encode. That's encode in ROT13. This is decode. When we hit this button, it's going to take whatever is in this guy, which is our output text view, and decode it. So we're going to have we'll call this guy decode text view, decode TV. All right, we'll set his gravity to center horizontal. And we'll make the text a little bit bigger. There we go. Let's put a little question mark in there for our placeholder, let's say. All right, so this guy's called Decode TV. So again, we're going to use MVC to give ourselves access to that text view. So we'll go into main activity. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you an alternative way of doing this. So we have this go button press. We'll just leave it named that, even though I changed the button to be called encode. We're going to create a function called public void decode button pressed. Take in a view as a parameter. Okay. And this guy is going to have to get access to the decode text view. So we'll create a text view, decode TV, is equal to the text view version of this dot find view by ID r dot ID dot decode TV. All right, by doing it this way, we only have access to decode TV. The scope of decode TV is local to this function right here. Now, let's say that we might want to have access to that guy in other places. What could we do? What would we do to increase the scope of decode TV so that it is available anywhere inside this class? So I want this guy to not just be available in here. I'd like him also to be available in here or in here, so on and so forth. I want to have access to him everywhere. Talking about variable definition and scoping rules.
Can you put that up?
So when I say scope, we're talking about where a variable is accessible, right? All right, so this guy, because I've defined him inside of this function right here, his scope is local to this function. He's only accessible from this line all the way up to this closing curly brace. But I want him to be available also in here. Also in here. I want him to be available anywhere inside of this class. What can I do to make this guy available in other places? Let me give somebody else a chance first. How do I change the scope of a variable?
Put it somewhere different.
Define it somewhere different. Okay, so where can I define this guy to give him a less limited scope? Who what? Okay, you want me to define him in the constructor? So do that. Does that solve the problem?
No.
Now what do I have?
Just in the constructor is where it was.
Yeah, I have a local variable that's scope is limited to the constructor now.
Is the name of the class dot?
Can we just put it under override?
So you want me to move it up here,
Would that be a problem?
but then maybe give its value inside here. So now I have a variable defined here that's accessible anywhere inside the class from this point forward. I'm going to give it its value here in the constructor, okay, because the constructor gets called first. Well, this is technically isn't the constructor, but it acts like a constructor on create for a activity. And I would usually write this dot before this guy. All right, so now, because I defined it here, even though I didn't give it its value till on create, the variable was actually defined here, therefore his scope is anywhere from this point forward up to the closing curly brace that matches this opening curly brace. Now, I would also probably want to make this guy private so that he's only accessible inside this class and only loosen it if I needed to. All right, so now I have access to decode TV in here. Similarly, I could have done the same thing with our input ET and our output TV. These same buttons, because I'm going to need output TV inside of my decode button pressed. So it probably would have made sense for me to move these guys out of here. Paste it in here. And then I'll
Question: if we change something in the function, would it change up like would it change the value of that thing too, or
change something in the function. What do you mean?
like for example, if you put some values in and then you change I don't know, like for example the go button press, if you use it, like you change something with the text view and then will it like be updated for the
Well, yeah, so that's kind of the point of this. So now I made these guys global, right? So I define them at the top of the class. This makes them global to the entire class. They're accessible anywhere in the class from this point forward. I'm giving them their values in here. This is okay because we know that onCreate is the first function that gets called for an activity in Android. Okay, so I know they will have values before I ever get to any of this code down here. All right, but because I defined them up here, I brought them into existence up here, their scope is now available everywhere. So if I change it down here, for instance, output TV, this stuff, this will still work because it will first look locally and say, I'm going to read in from input ET. So it's first going to look inside of this scope and say, is there an input ET in here? The answer is going to be no. Then it'll bounce up to the next level. Well, the next scope level is this level up here because these guys are their own individual scopes. This is its own individual scope, so on and so forth. So this is the top level scope here where I've defined these guys. So when I say input ET, it's going to look here first. When it doesn't find it, then it'll look at the next level. If it doesn't find it there, then it gives up because this was the top level. Now, if I wanted to be faster, I would say this dot input ET and this dot output ET. By putting this dot in front of it, I'm specifically telling it where this guy lives. I'm saying you don't have to look locally here. Just jump right up to the fields owned by this instance of our activity. So it won't waste its time looking locally. Okay. So now inside my decode button, we can see that these guys still work. So everything that used to work will still continue to work. Big money, big money. All right, so I'll put a D in there or something. Encode it, so there's my Q. So it still works. All I've done is I've expanded where those variables are accessible. So now I can use them in multiple functions throughout here because I'm going to need my output TV here in order to do my decode. Okay, so the job of my decode here, when I hit this button, I wanted to read this particular character and decode it and put the answer right here, which is called decode TV, which I already gave myself a global variable for that and defined it inside of onCreate. So now we have access to that. So I want to first read this character. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read it. I'm going to say char C is equal to, so I'm going to get, here, I'm going to call it encoded. Char encoded is equal to this dot output TV dot get text dot toString dot char at 0. Why am I saying dot char at 0 here? Why didn't I just say dot toString?
You're making sure that there's always get that character.
I'm trying to capture the encoded thing here. What type am I dealing with here? A char. What is a char? Single character. It's represented as a number, but ultimately it's a single character. Okay. If I had stopped at toString here, what would that have given me? What is this dot output TV dot get text dot toString? What kind of animal will that give me?
A string.
A string. What's a string?
String of quotes.
Collection of chars, right? Now we happen to know that this particular string only has one char in it. Okay, and where does that one char live?
0.
At bucket 0. Okay, but it's still a string. To a human being, we might look at it and say, oh, that only has one character. But if I want to get the character out of that string, I need to extract it. All right, because I'm going to store this guy as a char. Now, I could have chosen to store this as a string, and then I wouldn't have said .char out here. But then later on, when I want to go and convert it, I'm going to need to get the char out of it. So I might as well juice the char out of it initially, right? Everything's going to ultimately be about, I need to store a value of a certain type, so I need to go ahead and get that type. It makes sense? Why I want a char and not a string here? All right, so now I have the char, and I want to decode that char. How do I decode a char? Well, I encoded it by adding 13, and
So then you just convert.
okay, I need to go backwards.
You subtract 13.
So I want to subtract 13 from it.
That'd be logical.
I decided rot 13. The third one was good enough. All right, so to encode it, I called rot 13, which adds 13 and mods 26. To decode it, I also add 13, mod 26. Right? I mean, you can subtract 13 and mod 26. It'll still work. But we don't need to have two different ways of doing it. You get kind of why rot 13 was a convenient cipher?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's go ahead and hook our decode button pressed up because we need to let our button know that his on click should call this dude, right? All right, so I'm going to go over here to my activity main. I'll click on this button, decode. I'll go to his on click, hit the drop down. I'm going to say I want you to call the decode button when you're clicked. All right, so now when we call the decode button, so when we click this button, his on click will get performed, which we'll call the decode button pressed. What does the decode button do? It reads into a char called encoded the character that lives at bucket 0 of the string that is currently in output TV, so my encoded character. Then I call rot 13 on that encoded character, giving me the decoded version of it, which should be my original character, right? And then I'm going to set decode TV set text, which either takes which either takes a string or it takes an int. I think we saw this last time because we actually have this file called strings.xml where you can store like variables over time, and they will each have a unique ID, just like text views and buttons and things like that have. So if I try to give this guy just decoded like this, it's going to think everything's cool. It's not going to yell at me because this guy actually is represented as an int. Now, if I go ahead and I say this decode TV.set text, notice that there is, well, forget about these other versions of it, but these first two are the ones I care about here. The one that we really that we want to use is this char sequence one. And char sequence is, let's say it's like actually, I think string is a version of a char sequence. So it's actually like a lightweight string. It's a string that does less than full-fledged strings do. Let's leave it at that. It's basically a string. All right. So I have a version of set text that takes in a string, but I also have a version of set text that takes in an int. Now, even though I'm passing it a char, we know that chars are actually stored as ints. So it's taking in an integer in here, and it's expecting that to be the a ID of a resource, a unique ID of a resource, which we don't have one called decoded. So it's going to end up crashing when we run this. All right. So I don't actually want this guy to look up this resource. I instead want to turn that char into a string. And I do that by just concatenating it onto the empty string. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, this is, again, evidence that Java is a string-based language. So if we can get something, we can work with strings very easily in Java. If you want to turn any primitive type into a string, just concatenate it onto a string. I don't think you can do that with Booleans, but the other primitive types you can concatenate onto a string. Similarly, if you have a string representation of a primitive type, you can typically get it out into that primitive type pretty easily. Okay, so this should set the text back. That's what our decode button does, is it reads in our encoded character, calls ROT13 on that encoded character, storing the result inside of decoded, and then we build a string out of decoded, putting it back in our, well, putting it to our decode text view. Go ahead and run this guy. All right, so I can put an A there. When I hit encode, it turns it to an N. When I hit decode, it should turn this to an A. There's my A. That makes sense? So kind of see why Caesar used the ROT13 cipher for encoding his messages, because you can use the same technique to encode and decode. Kind of convenient. Okay. And of course, we use this for all top secret military stuff now. You know, we just, this is extremely, to be honest, it probably would be fairly effective, call it 98% of the time. You know, if 98% of the time, I'm just pulling a percentage out of the sky, right? But, you know, if somebody opened up an email and just filled with gibberish, something went wrong, right? You delete the email, reply back and say, gibberish. Okay, but if you knew that the person was sending it to you in ROT13, you could just write a little program that you just paste it in there, and you know, anything that comes in as ROT13 would you know, do a more robust job, I guess. Because right now we're rotating on single characters, right? But could we write entire sentences or books and things like that entirely encoded in ROT13? And it's pretty easy to decode that, right?
How difficult would it be with white balance state? I know that adds another character.
No, because what they do is they leave white space alone. Anything that's not part of the alphabet, they don't touch. Is kind of the MO. So only characters of the alphabet get converted. Everything else, question marks, things like that, just remain question marks.
Question marks and like exclamation marks and switch or anything like that?
No. I mean, you could. I mean, yeah. You could decide to augment ROT13 a little bit and say, I'm gonna treat, you know, alphabetic characters one way and other things I'm gonna do in some sort of reversible way. You technically could do it with the entire Unicode character set. I mean, it wouldn't be a big deal. You would just have to mod by a bigger value.
Yeah.
You know, you'd have to mod by 65,536 to make sure you always got a wraparound.
Yeah.
Okay. So go to our text here. We do have a
Some cool characters.
let's see, we can do a multi-line text, but I really want something a little bit bigger because multi-line I don't think will let me just drag one of these out here. I think I have to tell it the number of lines I want this guy to have. Let's test that. I just drug that widget out there. I want to see how that widget actually ends up working. Okay. Seems reasonable enough. All right, so I can write a book in there if I wanted to. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to actually delete this from here. I'm going to show you two different things here. All right, so this screen just shows us the simple encode or decode, right? So now what we want to do is we want to learn how to get to a second screen on our app, because most apps don't just have a single screen. right? We want to have a second screen. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and throw another button out here. Okay, and we'll call this guy ROT13 large text, something like that, just for what it'll print. So when we click this, we want it to take us to a new screen that will allow us to do encoding and decoding of like an email, right? You can copy a whole, write a whole bunch of text in there, hit encode, and it'll give you the gibberish version of it as a string. Okay, so we're going to need to have an on-click for this guy. So I'm going to go write a function that will take us to another screen. But before I do that, we should probably go ahead and create our other screen. And because I want this guy to take us to another screen, we're going to need a new destination. All right, so I'm going to go up to File here. And we're going to create, actually, I like doing it inside the app. I'm going to do it from the app instead. So I'm going to go to App Java. And then here's where our main activity lives inside of the starter project here. So go to your folder where it says main activity. I'm going to right click on this folder. I'm going to say new. I'm going to say activity. And I always start with empty activities. Once you get a lot more, if you start writing Android apps for professionally or something like that, you might choose to use some of their starting points, but I like to start with empty activities just to keep things simple. All right, so I'll choose empty activity here. It's going to bring up this little screen like this, and we're going to call this guy ROT13 large text activity. Okay, and make sure the checkbox for generate layout file is checked, and it goes ahead and it names your layout file it defaults a name. Unless you have a horrific problem with the name it gives it, just leave it. All right, now make sure the box that says launcher activity is not checked, because by making this a launcher activity, what that will do is it will change the default screen that our app will show, which is okay if you want this guy to be the new default screen. But in this case, we want this to be like a screen 2 in our app. All right, so we'll leave launcher activity unchecked, and then you can leave backwards compatible checked, and all the other stuff you can leave alone. Make sure the source language is Java. I actually have if anybody's interested, they can message me and I can send you the video for it. But I had a student. So there's this other language you could choose here called Kotlin. Mm-hmm. Kotlin. I don't know what the correct pronunciation is. But Java is what we're going to use in here because that's the language we've been learning, and now we're applying it to this other tool. But Android has added a new language called Kotlin as a possible scripting language you can use for writing your code instead of using Java. And I have a presentation from a student from the research class in the graduate program about some of the advantages of that. Really, it handles exception handling and stuff like that. So it kind of creates a little bit faster applications at the cost of having to learn a new scripting language, something like that. Actually, faster is probably not fair. Technically, it probably creates a slightly slower application, depending on how it converts it to the low-level language. But the programmer themselves has to do less work about checking for like null values and stuff like that. So like when we write code in Java, we need to be careful about trying to call functions on something that doesn't exist. So if we create like an object, for instance, well, here, let me just finish creating this. I'll just say, choose Java there. I'm going to hit finish. And then it's asking me if I want to add files to my Git repository. The answer for me is yes. We're going to talk about Git at some point. Okay, so now getting back here to main activity. So for example, if I define this text view, decode TV up here, but I never actually give it a value in here, then this is an empty object, right? This is a variable capable of holding something, but it doesn't actually hold anything. So if I try to start calling things, like if I say decode TV.setText on something that doesn't actually have a value, I'm going to have problems. I'm going to get out what's called a null exception, null pointer exception, because it's saying you're trying to call a function on something that doesn't exist. Well, a language like Kotlin does not require you to ask the question. It doesn't require you to say, if something bad happens, do this, or it doesn't require you to wrap it inside of what's called a try-catch. Instead, it'll just deal with it gracefully automatically. Because there's plenty of examples in programming, and we've kind of mentioned it in here before as well as in 200, where as a human being, we might know that the code that we've written will only execute a certain way. We might know that we have a for loop, and we know that A, we will definitely get into the for loop, and B, this function will definitely return something. We might know that as a person, okay? But Java doesn't trust that. Okay? Java knows that a for loop is a pre-check loop, so there is not a guarantee that you'll get into the loop, even if we know there will be. Okay? It also knows that an if statement is conditional, okay? Where we might know that eventually that if statement would fire. So if our return statement is inside of that, we know that the code we wrote would always return a value. But Java is going to scream at us and say, this function must return a value. While a language like Kotlin allows you to kind of say, just deal with if I don't return a value, I know I will. So you won't have to write those extraneous lines of code that you know will never get called. Because you're the human programmer who knows that I'm writing this line of code, I'm writing this return whatever down here to appease Java. It's a line of code that will never get reached. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So a language like Kotlin apparently, I haven't used it, but a language like Kotlin apparently has kind of that benefit where it doesn't force you into writing something. I don't know if I'm a fan of that or not. Certainly not from a teaching language perspective. Mm-hmm. I like for teaching languages, actually, if I had my druthers, I'd maybe prefer to teach with like C as the first language. You know, a language that you can really get into trouble with. Because, you know, I don't know, if you're rollerblading, the best way to learn you should wear knee pads is you crash a few times and you tear up your knees, you realize I should probably wear knee pads. So if you never get in accidents, if it always is, you know, just letting you slide by, then I don't know. I don't think it's that great of a training tool. Okay. So in any case, I've now created this second activity, and I'll go into that activity just for a second here. Is this it's in dark mode. It's kind of a weird looking thing. I'm going to go ahead and change my, well, not change, but I'm going to put it into my constraint layout, a vertical linear layout. So that's how I always start my things. And then I'll go ahead and just throw a text view in there. And I'm going to make this text view just say screen 2 for right now. You know, just to let me know I got to screen 2. All right. And I want to go up here to theme because I think it's currently set to, I'm guessing, dark theme. Why is dark theme the default?
I'll just switch the theme.
So I changed it to device. So I went in here, I hit the drop down. Well, no, I'm sorry. I went in here and I hit the drop down. I went to more themes and I just chose a theme from in here. And I went to, I think it was dark action bar was the one it set before. I just changed it to default, device default light. I mean, you can leave it as the dark one if you want. I just think it'll show up better as a white background here for now. Okay. So this is my second screen, but I currently have no way of getting to the screen. If I run my app right now, it's still going to go to my first screen as if I did nothing. I just added code that's completely unreachable at this point. All right, so we're still there in our first screen. Now what I want to do is I want this button here to take me to that second screen. And we're going to do this through something called an intent. And I want to say that at some point I did throw that into our notes. I didn't. Okay, that's fine. I was just for some reason I thought I had mentioned it and said, oh, we'll talk about this later. All right, so we're going to have something in here called an intent. Okay, so intents can actually be used for all sorts of stuff in Android, but we're going to pretend like right now they're only used for one thing, and that's for launching a second screen, launching an activity. Okay, they actually allow us to do things like launch email things and turn off GPS, turn on GPS, launch other applications. Let us do all sorts of things. All right. So an intent is an object that allows us to express to, let's just say Android, our intent to do something. Okay. So it allows us to describe what we want to do. Right now, we're going to only describe that we want to go to another screen. Okay. We will initially use this to let Android know that we want to go to another screen. All right. So now let's see how this works. So I'm going to go into my code here. I'm going to go ahead and write a function. So we'll create a public void. Actually, I'm in the wrong thing. I want to be in my activity main, or main activity. Because I want to write a function that that button will call. Public void, and let's call this, what do I call it, large text, button pressed, something like that. Takes a view v as a parameter, because it has to. It has to be public, has to be void, must take a view. You can name it whatever you want. You don't have to call it v. But that's how the design side of Android Studio picks up on the fact that you want this function to be one of the options for the on-click for buttons. All right, so inside here, what are we going to do? We want to create an intent. So I'm going to say I want to create an intent. I'll name it I. Go back. So when you start typing intent, it's going to show you the thing. Press enter on it. It'll go ahead and import that for you. So intent I is equal to a new intent. Now we build an intent using what's called a context. So I'm going to say this, and then what we want to do. So we want to go to rot13 large text activity dot class. All right. Now, have we mentioned context? We did. All right. So context is, we mentioned it, we said it's the scenario in which we are operating. So the context in this guy right now, this right here is the context associated with this particular activity. So the world that's currently on the screen, the world that we're currently operating within, is the activity that is this. All right, so I have to tell the guy what the current context is. Then I have to tell it what do I want to do? This is the what. Okay, there's a bunch of different things we could put here, but for right now, all we know is we can put other screens. Okay, so I'm saying I want rot13 large text activity dot class. That's the name of the class associated with the activity I want to go to. All right, then, now if I just create an intent, I haven't actually done anything, right? So if I'm sitting here in the chair and I intend to get up and walk to that door, not until I actually perform that task have I fulfilled, have I executed my intent, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so right now I just said I intend to do something soon. All right, so now I actually have to accomplish it. And what we do is we use the current activity to launch other activities. So I'm going to say this dot. So this is the current instance of our main activity. And I'm going to say, what is it? Launch, show, start activity. So this dot start activity. All right. And we pass it the intent associated with that. So I'm going to ask the current activity to start another activity. What activity? The one associated with this intent I just built. Okay. So now I'll go ahead and I'll let my interface know about, I'll let the buttons on click know about this guy. So I'll go to my activity main. I'll click on my ROT13 large text. I'll hit the drop down on the on click and I'll choose the large text button pressed function that should show up there now. Okay, and make sure after you hit the select there, you press enter, otherwise it doesn't lock in. Okay, so now it's actually there. You could also click off of it and click back onto it. I think that will also lock it in. But a common mistake is you think you set it, but you didn't actually set it. You just hit the drop down and made it appear in there, but you never actually locked it into that text box. All right, so now I'll hit play. And now when I hit that button, it should call that function, which creates an intent, which then asks the current activity to launch a new activity. All right, so now I'm on this second screen. Okay, and remember, if I want to get back to the first screen, Android devices have a back button built in. So I just hit that. I'm back to the first screen now. Okay, all right, so now what we want to do is we want to do some design on that second screen. But before we do that, I want to show you, because that design thing is going to actually be something that I'm going to have you do for your homework. But for a starting point here, I'm going to show you how do I pass stuff from the first screen to the second screen. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is we'll go back to our first screen here, and I will. Let's start off with just a piece of text. All right, so if I want to get this particular question mark or whatever is in my decode TV, if I want to get that to the next screen, so let's say on my second screen here, we'll have this guy say encoded text, because that's what's ultimately going to be in there. I'll set his gravity to center horizontally, and I'll make it a much larger thing. Okay, and for right now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a plain text thing. I'm sorry, not that. I want a text view. I'm going to put a text view in here. All right, I'm going to give this guy a name for right now. Actually, just so I can give you the correct type of landing, I'm going to take that text view out. I'm going to put a different kind of thing there that we just looked at. I'm going to put a multi-line text in here. So that's ultimately what we're going to have. Although, can I? That's for an input box. Does this guy let me define the number of lines? I think it actually will do it. We'll just leave it as this edit text. That'll let us work with it. All right, so we're going to call this guy output ET. All right, this is our multi-line editable text thing. And the main reason we want to do that is so that we can possibly copy it and throw it into an email or something. All right, so we could probably make an argument that maybe this isn't the right tool for this, but we're going to still make it the tool. that we're going to use. All right, and you can make it bigger or whatever, however you want to do it, but you'll see how this lines up to the homework assignment in a little bit. All right, so I'm just giving you a starting point here. So we'll say output ET is the name of this guy. So I want to give myself access to it inside of my code. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. And that guy is of type edit text. So I'll say private edit text. Now I'm inside of my ROT13 large text activity now, because that's the guy that owns that, that screen. And we'll call this guy output ET. And then inside of onCreate, I'll go ahead and set that. So I'll say this dot output ET is equal to the edit text version of this dot find view by ID r dot ID dot output T or output ET. Okay. So now I have access to that guy. And just to test this for a second, I'm going to go ahead and say this dot output ET dot set text equal to LOL. Just to prove that it's all hooked up. Okay. So now when we arrive at that second screen, it should just programmatically set our text to LOL. So click on that, takes us to this screen, and there's my LOL. Okay. All right. So now what we want to do is we want to actually, when I click this button, we want to have whatever is currently in this guy right here, which is called my output TV. I want to have that somehow travel to the next screen and show up in this box. Okay. So the question we're answering here is, how do I send data between screens? All right, so we have, well, you probably could have more than two approaches, but you have two generalistic approaches. You have the one that's built into Android, and that is an intent comes with its own luggage. All right, so intents have something called extras. Extras are like luggage. They allow us to pack data into them, and they travel with us to the destination screen. All right, so if you want to bring clothes on vacation with you, you pack it into the suitcase. You bring the suitcase with you to your hotel room. You open up the suitcase and your clothes arrived with you, right? Same thing here. We're going to use extras to accomplish the same thing. So after I create my intent, but before I start, ask the current activity to start the next intent. So that's back on this screen. So right in here, I've created the intent, but I haven't started it yet. I want to go ahead and pack a few things. Well, I'm going to pack one thing right now. So I'm going to say which is the name of my intent, dot put extra. Now I'm creating a name value pair here. So I'm going to name this guy whatever I want. This is like my variable name. So let's call this guy passed value. That's the value I'm passing between the screens. All right, I can name it whatever I want. I just have to, whatever I call it here is how I'm going to refer to it on the next screen. Okay, so I'm going to actually steal that string so I don't have to worry about spelling it right. All right, but now I give it the value associated with this guy. And the value I'm going to give it, this could be any primitive type as well as a string as well as arrays. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pass this guy as this dot output TV dot get text dot toString. So I'll pass it as the string version of the contents of our output TV, which by default was the question mark. That's this guy right here. So the default is the question mark, but if I click encode, so if I put a B there and hit encode, actually this is output, not the question mark. This is our decode TV. So the output here, the default was an A. Now I put something here, hit decode. Now it turns it into an O. So this is the value that I'm passing to that next screen. This guy's called output TV. All right. So now when I hit this, it's going to send that to that next screen. Why? Because I added it to my luggage here by putting an extra. I named it passed value, and the value I passed along is the string that was contained inside of output TV. All right, so that goes along with my luggage. Now, just because I sent it doesn't mean I have to unpack it. You could pack up a suitcase and never open it. Okay, or you pack that one pair of dress socks that you never actually wear. Okay, or in my wife's case, she packs an entire second suitcase of clothes that she might wear.
Or an entire tree.
You should just bring it here and set up here. Because if she doesn't want it at home, like.
No, it's getting set up at home. It's a $600 tree. It's getting set up at home.
How tall is it in front home?
I don't know, 7 feet, 8 feet. I mean, it like almost touches the ceiling.
Wow. Story telling is really good.
Seat's taken. That's a good idea. I would say I could set it up in the bedroom in front of the TV, but then that impacts me. Yeah. Because, you know, she falls asleep on her way down to the pillow. But I stay up for like 2 hours watching TV. And it bothers her. So I have these Bluetooth headphones I wear so that I can have the sound cranked.
Oh, okay.
But then they're noise canceling. So I got to make sure I wake up in the middle of the night if I fall asleep with them in. Otherwise, I won't hear my alarm. Okay, so we're going to pack this up. But now when we receive it on the other screen, once we're here, if I want to set some text, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to just create a string. And you can call this guy whatever you want. We'll call it value. All right, and I'm going to set this text equal to the value that was passed. And I do that by saying this dot. So just this dot intent, get intent. Yep. This dot get intent. So that gets me the intent that was used to get me to this place. So I'm asking the current activity to give me access to that intent, give me access to the thing that's carrying my luggage. Dot get extra, so it's going to be called a get string extra in this case. And the name of my extra was passed value. Okay, so I'm asking this activity to get the intent he was created with. I'm asking that intent to then give me an extra that was packed in there. And this extra was called passed value. I'm going to store it inside of a variable called value. I didn't have to store it. I could have just used it directly. But then in here, I'm going to set the text to value. Make sense? So I'll go ahead and hit run. So now whatever is in that output TV, so right now it's an A. I hit that, now there's an A there. If I change it to something else, so I hit encode, now it's hit encode better, now it's an N. Hit this, now it's an N that passed. Okay, so I'm passing the value that's in that thing to that second screen. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's one way we can pass things. Now, another way we can pass things actually, before I show you that, just so I make sure we have time to get you everything you need for your assignment, I want to go back to this screen. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and I actually want to replace all this stuff up here with something else. I don't want to take away this code. So we'll just do it on the other screen. This will be fine. All right, so I'm going to show you an alternate way of passing the text now. Remind me, what's a design pattern? We specifically have been using the MVC design pattern recently, right? Model View Controller. It says it's a good idea to separate our data from our code from our interface. Okay, what's a design pattern in general? What's the kind of the generic definition for a design pattern?
That's how we have our project organized.
It has to be in the notes. Where do we introduce MVC? Or did I just talk about it out loud?
I think we were just talking about it. I feel like there was a slide for MVC though.
It was what? Oh, here it is. So I just talked about design patterns out loud. All right, so we'll throw in a slide then for it. Design pattern is a proposed, quote, good solution to a, quote, common problem. All right, so the good and common are all relative, right? Who knows how good something is, and what's a common problem to one person is not necessarily common to another person. But academics like these design patterns, and they all have funny names too. All right, so we've looked at this, but this is just a generic idea. A design pattern is kind of, here's a potential way you can do something that's a decent way of doing it. All right, and we looked at MVC. Well, now we're going to introduce another design pattern. And this design pattern is called the singleton design pattern. All right, now a singleton, sorry, something went wrong. I have to close it? Thank you. Oh, it's okay. Everybody relax. We'll just say it out loud for right now. At least we got the word in there, right? Okay. So singleton says that it's a good idea to keep something that needs to be shared among multiple, in our case here, multiple screens in a single place. Now, we could probably make the argument that we can say data that needs to be shared among more than two things should be kept in a single place. All right. So the real life example of this is, let's say that you are in an apartment with 3 roommates and you all share one car. Okay. So there's one set of keys and the car is available. Maybe you keep the keys inside of a drawer. Okay. And the car is available as long as the keys are in the drawer. So everybody goes to that single drawer to check, to retrieve the keys. If it's there, they can use the car. If it's not there, they can't use the car. Something like that. Okay, but they've kind of picked a central location that each one of the roommates has access to in order to store that piece of information, that thing they might want to use. Okay, so what we can do is we can build a singleton. Okay, we're going to build a class that we're going to use that's going to store stuff that's accessible to all of our different screens. Okay, this isn't the best example here because I'm only sharing it between two screens, but I'm showing you an alternative way of getting data from one screen to another screen. Okay, so I'm going to go into my code here. I'm going to right click. I'm going to say new. So I just went into the same place where I did my new activity. So the little folder here that has my activities in it. I'm going to right click. I'm going to say new. Now, notice here that they give you an option for a singleton. I don't like the way that they do their singletons. So I'm not going to do a singleton their way. I'm just going to create a normal Java class. All right. Now, I like to call the singletons in my projects just core for no good reason. It's just like a core storage place to whatever. Okay. So you can name it whatever you want, but I'm going to call this guy core. And just hit OK. And I'm going to say remember. It's going to keep adding it to my Git repository. All right. So now I have this class called core. All right. So now for a singleton, what you do is you fill this guy up with static variables. Okay. So in this case, I want to store one piece of information. Okay. I'm going to store a string that I'm passing between screen 1 and screen 2. So I'm going to say, I'm going to make it public. I'm going to make it static, which means it's owned by the class. And by it being static, I call it using the name of the class in which it was defined. This guy's going to be a string. I'm going to call this guy past value, just to match up with what we did before. All right. And I'll start it being equal to the empty string. That way it has an initial value. All right. So since this guy is static, he belongs to the class. He's a field, no parentheses. So I would reference this guy by saying core dot past value. So over here in main activity, rather than putting this extra, rather than packing the luggage, I can instead say core dot past value is equal to this dot output TV dot get text dot toString. So I'm storing the exact same values I did before, but I'm actually just throwing it into my singleton, kind of this global scope. All right, so I've created this scope called core that's accessible anywhere inside the entire project. Okay? Yep.
If you change the values, like you change the value of past value, will it change in core too?
It changed. That's the point. It changes it. So when because I am setting it here, right? I'm setting this variable equal to this value. I'm changing it. It started off as the empty string. Now it's whatever was in output TV. So now when I arrive over here, rather than getting the value from my intent, I'll instead string value is equal to core.passValue. So I'll just grab it from the singleton. All right. Now, if you use Android's built-in singleton and even Eclipse's built-in singleton, what they actually do is they do it as an instance. So you have a bunch of instance variables in there, and then they have a function called getInstance that returns the instance of it. Here, I'll actually show it to you here real quick. I'll just create a second singleton here, and I'll call this guy core2. Okay, and so what it does is here, I'll fix the parentheses so I don't go insane. All right, so what it does is it creates a static variable. It also creates a final variable, which means you can't change it, called core2. Well, I'll type core2 called rInstance, and it sets that equal to new core2. And then it gives you a variable that's a function, rather, static, that returns an instance of core2 called getInstance. And what this guy does is he will return our instance. So to use this one, you would have to say core.getInstance dot, and then you could grab values from it, instead of just saying core.thevalue. There probably is a memory benefit to this instead of having a single class that overarches everybody. But I don't think that outweighs the benefit of just being able to write it pretty simply here. I mean, this was not a whole lot going on here, right? And it let data go from screen 1 to screen 2. Well, we haven't seen it yet, but trust me, it's going to let data go from screen 1 to screen 2. So I'm just grabbing core.passValue on screen 2. I'm storing it in a variable, even though I didn't need to, and then I'm using that variable to populate my output ET. So go ahead and show this to you real quick. So right now it's an A. When I hit this, it'll store the A in the singleton. This guy will then retrieve the A from the singleton. There's my A. Make sense? So now singletons are dangerous. And this is why they're dangerous. They're really convenient, right? That was a lot easier than doing the whole put extra thing.
Yeah.
But I would still say if you're only sharing data between one screen, well, between two screens, put extras makes more sense. And this is why. Because singletons are so convenient, you can fall into the trap of using them for everything. So all of a sudden, you have variables stored in your singleton, maybe rightly so. These are variables that maybe are shared between 3, 4, 5, 6 screens. Maybe you have an app that has 6 or 7 screens in it, and you want the username, the current logged in user, to be available to all those screens. Singleton makes perfect sense for that. Okay? But if you only need to get one value from one screen to a second screen, throwing it in the singleton is just making your singleton messier. And for really large applications, what you end up with is this monstrous singleton that looks like just the most messed up bedroom you've ever seen in your life. Some of the variables belong there, but some of them you put there because you thought it was convenient. But now when you come back to that project 6 months later, you have this single file with 4,000 variables in it. And you have to go find the right variable that's in there that was just sharing one piece of information between 2 screens. When you could have just thrown that one thing inside of an extra, just getting it between the screens, and it wouldn't have added to your singleton. All right, so use singletons when they make sense. They are very powerful, okay? But try not to use them just because they're convenient, because it's not that inconvenient if you're only sharing a couple of values between exactly 2 screens. All right. Once you get to the point when you have the same value that needs to be shared among 3 screens, you can probably go ahead and just give yourself permission to use a singleton. All right. But for 2 screens, just use put extra and don't make a mess in your singleton. All right. You're not going to always listen to me. You're going to go and make a singleton because it's so easy. And then at some point when you write a larger project, you're going to say, man, this singleton's a mess. And then you start naming variables based on what screen you're sharing them with. So you might have like the same variable name, reasonably speaking, but you actually have it like main activity underscore count. And then you have screen 8 underscore count inside your singleton because you needed to pass the count between both of these screens, but you needed to keep them straight in your head for what screen you were sharing it with. I can, at some point when I have my Mac, I'll show you an example of a project that I did that in, and it's I think with the singletons like 2,000 lines long. You end up having more comments than anything else, and all of a sudden it's not as convenient as it should have been. Okay, so it makes sense how you can get information between one screen and another screen? Okay, so for our homework, I'll go ahead and just so you have the starting point, I'll go ahead and commit this. So share data between screens. Okay, so for your homework, You can create a new project if you want, or you can keep going with your current project. We're going to do rot 13, but I want you to make it work for not just a single character. You should be able to type a sentence in. Hello, how are you? Potentially, you could type in a whole email or something like that if you want. Write a whole book, but a string, and then encode that entire string using rot 13. Outputting the result in, you can do it in a text view, you can do it in one of those long multi-line edit text, doesn't really matter. Just prove that you can encode an entire string, or that could be hundreds of lines long potentially, with as rot 13. And now rot 13 only changes characters. Okay? It changes upper and lowercase characters. So lowercase characters wrap to lowercase characters, uppercase characters wrap to uppercase characters. Okay, but it only actually changes letters. Anything that's not a letter, anything that's spaces, punctuation, any of those things, just remain the same.
Okay.
That makes sense? Okay, so read in a string, encode that entire string in rot 13, output the encoded string. Okay, you probably should test it by also decoding it, but you've seen that decoding is the same as encoding it, right? All right, questions about what I'm asking you to do? All right, so you already have an example here for encoding a single char and decoding a single char. I want you to expound on that by encoding and decoding an entire string. All right, so today, student, faculty, staff, Bible study, God and grub. Go down to the cafeteria, sign in, get free lunch, take it down to the terrace room.
You guys grab lunch?